Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today. Today, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about how to keep supply chain attacks off the menu. I'll have a short presentation before moving into a live demo. And as mentioned, there will be time at the end for questions as well. So first, who am I? My name is Jeff Stern. A fun fact about me is that I used to have a frog named Frog, so I'm especially excited to be presenting here today with JFrog. And I'm also a product manager at Tidelift and have been working there for the past few years. So first, let's talk about what supply chain attacks even are. A software supply chain attack happens when someone manipulates third-party code in your software to gain access to your systems. We're now all super familiar with the high-profile example of the recent SolarWinds breach. This is an example where hackers were able to inject code into a SolarWinds system called Orion, a system that's used by tens of thousands of customers, including the US government. And after SolarWinds, software supply chain has become a major government policy priority. The White House recently published an executive order on America's supply chains. The order referenced all supply chains, not just our software supply chains, but there was this one line in here that read, including risks posed by supply chains' reliance on digital products that may be vulnerable to failures or exploitation. And increasingly, software supply chain security is becoming synonymous with open source software supply chain security. 85% to 97% of enterprise code bases contain open source software, as you can see in this article on the screen. The question isn't if our applications run on open source code, but rather how much and on which open source specifically. And are we doing enough to keep the open source software supply chain secure? And when we talk about the open source software supply chain, this recent topic gives us a great window into the problem that we're trying to solve. We're all building these applications that depend on literally thousands of open source packages. There's this piece of infrastructure somewhere out there that many of us are depending on and using that's being maintained for free. And it being maintained is a best case scenario. What's more common is the maintainer has lost interest in the project a few years back and is getting overwhelmed with requests. And there have been no new updates released recently. But to be clear, we at Tidelift and at JFrog, we think open source is amazing. It creates a ton of benefits for organization, especially your engineering teams. It unlocks innovation, it speeds time to market, and it's simply just the way that software is built now. But we're also pragmatic and recognize that open source is built by thousands of people with their own goals, motivations, and their own lives. And it's on us as the consumers of the software to stay on top of the issues that can emerge. It's not the responsibility of some random person in Nebraska. And I do love that comic, but I also like to point out that Tidelift has really taken the time to create relationships with these random people from Nebraska. They're not all from Nebraska. On the left, that's a picture of me and Olivier. He's the maintainer of Material UI. Andre Arco in the middle is a maintainer of a Ruby package named Bundler. John Leader and Jordan Harband on the right are maintainers of popular JavaScript packages. They're also speaking at an event that we have coming up called Upstream, which we'll talk a little bit more about at the end. And the most valuable thing that we Tidelift are doing for your supply chain is that we're not just making relationships and drinking beers with these maintainers, we're also making paid offers available for their most used packages. And if the maintainers already have a good job that lets them maintain their projects, then that's fine. They don't need to take these offers. But if they're otherwise considering abandoning the project, which is very common, these offers can keep that from happening. And many supply chain attacks have come directly from abandoned or under-maintained projects. But what else can you do to protect your supply chain and reduce the risk of supply chain attacks? Well, this one independent author on the internet, John P. Mello, gives us a few ideas. He says that you can check your sources. You can maintain an inventory of components. You can keep your software up to date. You can shift detection and behavior analysis left. And he lists a few other ideas for what you can do. But all of that, it's a lot of work. It's easier said than done. It requires a ton of coordination across the organization. So I want to ask, how are you doing today? Are you feeling proud and confident, like my frog named Frog? Or maybe you're feeling a little uncertain and sad, like this avocado-shaped frog. Well, we actually did a survey to see how confident teams feel in their open source management and their ability to mitigate supply chain attacks. And the answer is not very. As you can see from the survey, only 16% of large companies are feeling extremely confident in their open source management practices, and 39% are feeling not very confident or not at all confident. It's a lot of folks worrying about stuff. And as this becomes more prominent in the news, hitting the New York Times front page, 60 Minutes, it's more than just the engineering teams. It's the CISOs, the development managers that are all starting to focus and think about how can we reduce the risk of these supply chain attacks. And when we ask them what they are doing today to manage open source, we typically see a spectrum with organizations falling closer to one side of the other of the spectrum. For some development teams that are taking this centralized approach on the right, you might have weeks or months long process to manually approve a small JavaScript package. And you're reducing your risk, but developers are often frustrated and progress stalls, and it takes longer to ship your software. On the other end, a distributed approach that's focused on just moving fast. Development teams can bring in whatever they want. It's their problem. They can address the risk. They can think about it themselves. And maybe we give them some scanning results and some vulnerabilities we're concerned about, but often those issues are deprioritized or ignored, and there's no way to truly understand fully across the organization what's going on. Nobody wants to choose between these two things. We want you to be able to move fast and stay safe. So the solution that we're going to talk about is how you can do both. It's what we call a managed open source strategy. A managed open source strategy helps your organization keep open source secure and well maintained. At Tidelift, we have a specific approach to managed open source. We deliver it to you through catalogs, which are a mechanism that allow you to shift the management burden off of your developers and move the management earlier in the software development lifecycle to shift it left into a centralized place. We also make your life managing catalogs much easier by providing data and recommendations that we're getting from those maintainers directly, such as how to handle a security vulnerability. Where did this idea come from? Well, we first started asking, how are the largest tech companies doing it? How are Google and LinkedIn and Netflix all managing their open source? And we found that each of these companies have a similar solution. They create a catalog or a paved path for their developers. They're maintaining it centrally. They're not pushing issues off to individual development teams and asking them to go hunt down some esoteric open source trivia. What's the license? Is this a vulnerability we care about? Duplicating those efforts across the organization. At Tidelift, we call that paved path a catalog. The catalog is core to the Tidelift product, and it's how you and your development teams would interact with open source. This is an example page from our UI for one package that's in a catalog view, a JavaScript package. You can see here there are different releases. 3.0.11 is approved, 3.0.10 has been requested, 3.0.5 has been denied with a note explaining why it has been denied. And these notes can be communicated back to the development teams. And because we partner with Artifactory and we have an integration with Artifactory, we also sync these statuses back with your actual artifacts. So if you are storing the actual binaries for these packages in JFrog Artifactory, you can use our plugin to keep the unapproved packages and the denied packages from ever being downloaded and used within your company. Tidelift becomes your single source of truth for known good maintained open source components, and JFrog Artifactory is your source of truth for all of your organization's binaries and cloud native artifacts throughout the SDLC pipeline. So we're going to be moving into a demo shortly, and I'll show you a little bit about how you can get started along the managed open source journey. But I just want to share this model, this framework that we use with all new customers at Tidelift. It's a staged approach to bringing managed open source throughout the organization. It's not something that you can adopt all at once. It takes time. It requires work from many different stakeholders to really move towards these best practices and managing your open source. And today's demo is really going to be focused on the first two stages of this journey, understand and build. In the understand phase, the major first step is just simply understanding what open source you're using today across the whole organization. I'm no longer surprised to find that many organizations don't actually have a great sense of this today. If you look across all of your packages, what's being used by different teams, where is there overlap, where is there differences? So we'll look at the demo of how you can get a bill of materials for each of your different projects. Once this is established, we encourage customers to move into this build phase and creating a paved path for developers or a catalog, picking out policies that matter, whether that's licensing or security, and starting to take stock of all of your open source components, bring them into the catalog. The goal here is to get your developers asking, am I aligned with the paved path or not? And that's it. They don't have to think about security issues or licensing issues. They just have to know, is the stuff that I'm using, is 100% of it approved for use in my catalog? So along each part of this journey, you're building toward using open source to its full potential. Like Google, Netflix, and LinkedIn, you're not being held back by the kinds of issues that can slow development down. Great. So it's a little bit about supply chain attacks and how we and JFrog recommend you reduce the risk of them within your organization. I'm going to do a short demo now of 3 different things in the Tidelift product. I'm first going to show you how you can get a bill of materials for a project. Then I'll show you how you as a team can decide on the policies that matter for your paved path for your catalog. And then I'll show you how you can request open source for the paved path, how you can bring it into the catalog, whether that's from a project specifically or from JFrog Artifactory. And if you would like to follow along with this demo, you can. At that URL, you can start a free trial of Tidelift. It's a 14-day trial, but encourage you to start it. If you need more time, we can always extend it for you later. And you'd be able to do everything that I am walking through during this demo. Great. So if you actually did type in that URL, this is the page that you would land on, ptm.tl/trial. You go ahead and start the trial now and create an account. Great, I'm going to name my organization. I work for Tidelift, so I'll go ahead and type that in. And now I'm within the Tidelift product. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to show you how to get a bill of materials for one of your projects. This bill of materials is the list of all of the open source software that's in use. And so I'll do this by clicking over to projects and creating a new project. I'll name the project. I'll select next. So I'm going to go ahead and upload the files through the UI. I will point out that we also have a CLI tool, which I will not be demoing today, but it allows you to script all of this or do it from the command line if that's your team's preference. Or if you want to get started in just a couple of minutes, you can also upload files through here. So I am going to find 2 files on my computer and select them. These are the gem file and gemfile.lock, which are the 2 files in Ruby projects that define all of the direct and transitive open source that's being used. We never have to look at any of the rest of your source code. We just have to look at these files that contain the list of open source that's in use. We do have a full documentation on all of the different files that we support. We support ecosystems, everything from Ruby gems to JavaScript to Go, PHP, NuGet, Maven, and you can see the files that we need as well. So we'll go ahead and hit upload. So this takes just a few seconds to generate the bill of materials. And as this is going, I'll just talk that typically what we see as teams start to fully adopt a managed open source strategy is this becomes integrated into CI/CD pipeline, so that every time that there's a new change to one of your applications or one of your projects, the bill of materials gets updated in Tidelift as well. So you always have that accurate bill of materials. Oh, I picked the wrong files. So sorry about that. This is files with just a single package release, but that's okay. We can create another one. Do a JavaScript project this time. But while that other one uploads, I can show you here the bill of materials. You can imagine this is a bigger project. This table should be much longer. There'd be dozens of packages all listed here with the name of the package, the specific version, the license, and if it's being used directly or if a different package is bringing it in. So that's the first part of the demo, just being able to like see the open source that you're using and just being able to compile it from all of your different projects across your organization. You can start doing that with Tidelift. It gets more interesting from here though, because now I want to talk about how you can start setting up that paved path and start creating a catalog of what you define to be as known good and acceptable for within your organization. So here's the default catalog that gets created. There's nothing in it yet. In just a little bit, we'll go ahead and add some packages to it. But first I wanted to show this section called standards. Standards are our name for policies that get applied to the catalog. We want every package, every specific release of a package that gets added to a catalog to meet these standards. And I'll just read off some of the ones that are available. The releases have no vulnerabilities. This one's turned on already. Releases use approved licenses. We'll set this one up in just a little bit. Releases are actively maintained. We're working with the maintainers to know if something has been deprecated, if there's an alternative available. So we can turn this one on. And we can also look at the approved licenses one and set this up. So to set up the license compliance standard, you need a license policy. You need to know which licenses are approved for use within your organization and which ones are denied. I'll just show you, if we continue without a template, the work that would be required to set this up. Here we have 469 different SPDX formatted licenses. These are a standardized format that we do the work with the maintainers to make sure all open source software packages are in this, the licenses in this format. So if you don't already have a policy in place, you might have to go through each one of these and decide to approve this one, deny this one, for this one. I'm just selecting these randomly. But we also have some templates available that were created with our legal co-founder, Louis Villa. And we'll select the mobile app hardware one, which is a more conservative license template that as there are stricter policies in place for open source that's being distributed on mobile apps or in hardware. So we'll select that. And this looks great for now. We can see there's 100 something licenses that are approved for use, 100 something that are denied to use, and several more that no decision has been made on them yet, but these are fairly rare and uncommon licenses that we recommend just handling one off at a time. So we'll go ahead and save this. Great. So at this point, we've gotten the bill of materials for a couple of projects. We've also looked at our catalog and set up the standards or the policies that we want to uphold on our paved path for the open source that comes into it. And now this third part of the demo is we're actually going to start adding package releases to the catalog. So we can come back over to the bill of materials. And if you didn't catch what I did name the project Ruby, but this is actually a JavaScript-based file. As we can see, this is a very large bill of materials with 1,000-something packages. And what I'm going to do is you can now pretend that I'm a developer that's working on this project. And I'm just going to request all of these releases to be added into my catalog. I'll do that same thing for the one package as well. Actually, I want to do this. Great. So just take a couple seconds to run. Great. So while those thousands of JavaScript packages get requested as it runs, I did want to point out this Rails package, this package called Bundler that we brought into the catalog. It turns out we were just notified that there's a security vulnerability that's impacting Bundler. So we make this task available for you or for your centralized catalog administrator to go ahead and be notified of the security vulnerability and decide how you want it to be handled within your paved path. Is this okay? Can we create an exception, or should we remove it from the paved path and ask developers to find an alternative package to use? So let's go and look at this task. So this is a CVE that's published in the NBD database. Tidelift has taken that information, associated it with specific versions. And what I think is really cool is we also provide this recommendation directly from the maintainer of Bundler on what they recommend doing about the security vulnerability. So they recommend replacing it with an unaffected release, and they have some additional notes here. And let's just go ahead and accept this recommendation. So it looks like there's this unaffected release 2.2.17 that can be used. There's this note that we'll share out with the team on why they can no longer use 2.0.1. And we'll also put this into effect, let's say a week from now. Let's give people 1 week to move off of the vulnerable version and onto the new release. We'll go ahead and update the catalog. I also want to show that you can import your package releases from the projects that your developers are already building. This is a place where I like to highlight the JFrog Artifactory integration as well. You can add packages to your catalog from projects, but if you set up the integration with JFrog Artifactory, you can also get a list of all of the package releases that are in your artifact manager and bring them directly into Tidelift, and then be made aware of any potential security vulnerabilities like the one that we just saw, anything that's not in compliance with your license policy, or anything that's deprecated. In Tidelift, you determine if those package releases should be approved or denied for use. And then in JFrog Artifactory, we sync back a status, that approved denied status. And we have a plugin that prevents you from being able to download anything that is unapproved. So because that's still running that big 1,000-something package request, I do want to show this package page. And here's the package page I was showing earlier in the slides for view. From here, you or your developers would be able to see request new releases and also see the statuses for each release within your catalog. So we'll go ahead and request this one. Let's just approve it. Apologies, this is running a bit slow right now. There we go. Now we can see this is all of the packages within my catalog. You can click in here. You can see the approval status and the notes. And any projects that are using this release, we can see it all here in this centralized place. Right now, there are none. So that's it. That's a little bit about supply chain attacks and how you can get started creating a bill of materials and creating a paved path of open source for your development teams to use using Tidelift and by integrating with Artifactory. So at this point, that concludes everything that I was prepared to share. And I am happy to take any questions that you have about supply chain attacks or Tidelift. And we also have Mark Gulpin from JFrog if you have any deep questions about JFrog or Artifactory. So thank you so much. Oh, sorry, I did have a couple more things before we move on to questions. Let me come back here. If you want more after this presentation, there are a few things that we recommend. One is if you have children or if you just enjoy children's books, there is a book that we published, with JFrog called Cooking with Tidelift and JFrog that explains a lot of these concepts about open source management and supply chain attacks in a fun and illustrative form. You can download it at that link, tdlft.co/swampup. If you'd like to meet some of the maintainers that I was featuring earlier in the presentation, some of them are presenting at our event Upstream on June 7th, and you can learn more about that at upstream.live. And finally, SwampUp is coming up at the end of the month, and Tidelift, including our CEO, Donald Fisher, will be presenting there as well. And that officially concludes my presentation. Thank you again so much.
Okay, Jeff, so I think we have one question, a few questions actually in the Q&A box, if you want to. I think you're on mute.
I am, yeah. It looks like the first question is about how you might go about setting up Tidelift and Artifactory for different environments. You might set it up for a production environment versus a test environment. I don't know, Mark, would you be interested in taking that one?
Yeah. Hi, by the way, I'm Mark Galpin. I'm a product manager at JFrog. So I think, generally speaking, most customers have, it's important to make a distinction here between the production and test environment of your software SDLC and the production and test environment of your actual CI pipeline, right? Like every other production grade tool, the tools that support your SDLC themselves need a staging environment. But I'm going to assume from the context of this question that you're actually referring to, the actual software that you're actually trying to produce for business value. And in those cases, usually you have one Artifactory, but you may have different policies, right? So you may have a scenario where, you may have very strict rules, usually at kind of the staging late CI level, where you're very strictly enforcing your open source policies. And then you may have actually in some cases much lighter rules as you get into production, simply so that you aren't interfering with any sort of legacy behaviors. One of the things that kind of gets interesting once you're talking about production is you have a lot of policies and you want to enforce those policies strictly. But once something's actually in production, you kind of get to the point of, well, you can't break production just because a policy changes or because new information is discovered. Like, you can't just take down production, even for a very, very critical security bug, right? In the most cases, you don't want to take down production because of it. You may want to fix it as quickly as possible. Like, you may want to have your developers working 24/7 behind the scenes to fix it, but they're probably not trying to take down production while they do it. And so typically we recommend, and likewise, some people at the developer level, they may want to give their developers more flexibility to play around, right? And to try things that maybe, haven't been vetted yet or whatever. That's a little bit, that will be very much dependent on your company culture and how that goes, whether or not that's something you want to do. But typically at that staging integration level, that's where you want your strictest enforcement of policies. Don't let things move forward that break your policies. And then if the policies are looser later, that's going to be less of a problem for you, basically, right? Just enforce it. Everybody should be going through staging, and at staging, every policy is very strictly enforced to the level that you would expect, to what you want to achieve in production. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Mark. Looks like there was another question about who is responsible for managing the catalog in Tidelift, which I think is a really good question and something that we talk a lot about with new customers. Because depending on the environment you're coming from, it could end up being a lot of work if you're shifting the work that used to be on your development teams to be more central and governed more centrally. It may not just be one person. You might have one person that is capable of thinking through licensing decisions and security decisions and architectural decisions, who should be using or shouldn't be using, but likely that's going to be split up across different roles. And we do a lot to try to make the lift as low as possible. That license policy that I was showing earlier is one example. You can set up those automatic rules for what should be approved and what should be denied so that you don't have to think about it each time something new comes through. With security, we're also providing those recommendations. So if you choose to, you could just choose to accept Tidelift's recommendations and not have to triage each security vulnerability yourself.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I see that Mark answered another question through the chat. It looks like we don't have any more questions left. Anything you want to add for the end, Jeff?
No, just thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about how to reduce the risk of supply chain attacks, and hope to see some of you all at Upstream and at Swamp Up.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff, for this great presentation. Thank you, Mark, for coming on the session and answering the questions. As we mentioned in the beginning, you will receive the recording of the webinar by the end of this week. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Goodbye.